Hey everybody, welcome to Nikon School at the Photography Show. We're going to go through some wonderful images today. Andy is going to talk about some of the art of animal portraiture. He's going to show some of his amazing images that he's shot over the years. There's going to be loads of different subjects that we'll cover. And if you want to ask any questions, if there's any questions that you have, whether it's about your camera kit, whether it's about wildlife photography or about the subjects that Andy's had chance to shoot, then please do let us know by asking any questions that you have in the chat. Andy's going to go through some of his pictures first, and then we're going to ask some of the questions towards the end as well. So, Andy, I'm going to hand over to you. You all ready?
Okay, all good. Ready? Okay, perfect. So welcome everybody. This is the art of animal portraiture. This is where we're going to try and look at different ways that we can show the character, the personality, try and articulate in an image, I guess, what we might imagine our animal subjects are thinking about. So we're going to start in the wilds of Kamchatka with a Kamchatka brown bear. And for me, looking through my super telephoto 600mm lens as I took this image, the little nuances I was looking for, it was the whites in the eye. It was that little sideways glance. And for me, this image is all about the bear sort of, he's saying, well, you can try and take my fish. I don't recommend you try and take my fish, but you can certainly try. He's got that sort of slightly menacing look. And again, with wildlife photography, it's all about the characters, all about the personality, and it's about, yeah, just noticing those little movements. And for me, with this image, it was all about the whites of the eye. Of course, it's nice that the fish's tail has serendipitously sort of framed the face, and that focuses more of our attention on it. You can't really legislate for luck like that. You can't anticipate it. It's just one of those things that can occasionally happen. It's always nice when it does. Intensity, of course, is massively important. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start with some apex predators, and then we'll move on to British wildlife in just a few slides. So this is just a young tiger. He's only maybe 16 or 18 months, so he's maybe 6 months away from independence, but he's up on a rock above me. And with the cat species, especially tigers and lions, so often you're looking for that pupil in the middle of the eye, because then you've got that fixed stare. Now, often it's preferable that they're not fixed on you, that they're fixed on a prey species. But in this moment, there was something about the movement in our Jeep that triggered this youngster's fascination. And in my 20-year career, I would say this is arguably one of the most intense experiences of my life, because it's not an underestimation to say I was almost paralyzed by his look, because it had so much intensity, so much interest. I've subsequently found out from a cat sort of behavioral specialist that the position of the ears means that this was much more of a look of interest as opposed to, you know, an interest in predation. There wasn't any sort of malevolence, there wasn't any threat here. At the time, it felt like it, because to have a tiger on an elevated rock sitting above you, I was in a vehicle which we call greenie. It had no windows, it had no doors, it had no sides, it had no windscreen at all. So we were kind of a sitting duck, and we were only a couple of meters away from this tiger. So an intense moment, but for me, it was all about the look of intensity in the eyes, the centrally placed pupil. Moving on, again, so often with wildlife photography, when it comes to trying to create that really intimate feeling, being at the eye level of the subject can really help. Now, this in order to achieve that with this image, I had to be incredibly uncomfortable, because I was lying in about 8 inches of water, and I actually had a good friend of mine who was trying to stay dry, so he decided to lie on my back, staying dry, and then use the top of my head as a tripod, or as at least a beanbag to rest, so he could get a nice stable shot. But either way, to have an adult male grizzly bear walking down a remote Alaskan shoreline, and he had a penetrating gaze. He was walking quite intently towards us, and we had a guide with us at all times, obviously. But yeah, the bear just kept coming, and I was shooting on my 200 to 400mm lens, my Nikon 200 to 400. And as he kept coming closer and closer, I ended up having to turn it into portrait shape just to get the whole bear in. So again, it's an image that's all about the look. It's about that connection, that one-on-one connection between me and the bear. I knew that the entire time that bear was approaching us, that he was looking directly at us. Again, in the critical moment, he just wandered off around and went clamming, but it was certainly quite an incredible moment. So that sort of feeling of intensity, again, so now we're going back to Kamchatka and the Kamchatka brown bears. And again, for me, this was again, it's the little details with this bear. When he would emerge from the water with or without a fish, usually he looked a bit more annoyed when he came out without a fish, but he almost give this cursory glance up at us on the fishing bank. So here there's a disconnect between me and the bear. He's actually looking up and away from me, but it was the little detail of the white in the corner of the eye that gave this image that extra bit of intensity. Of course, the full frame, I framed this on a Nikon 800mm lens. It was loaned to me by a friend who was actually with me at the time, very generously. Fantastic piece of glass. So yeah, I framed him tightly to focus all of the attention on the bear itself. I've increased my ISO up to about 3200 so I could really stop down the aperture. So I've got front to back sharpness whilst retaining a fast shutter speed, because I want to freeze those water droplets and obviously freeze the motion. So yeah, it all adds up. So closer to home, back to Derbyshire now. And what I've done here is I've used side light again. The side light kind of increases the feeling of intensity and almost a feeling of malevolence. This swan didn't have an issue with me. He was actually driving some youngsters away from his territory. He was coming into full breeding plumage. And the lakes around me that I photographed, they only support one breeding pair. So any other swan, any Canada goose, any other species that's of a sort of competing size, the swans won't tolerate. As soon as they land on the lake, the swans are after them, and they won't relent until they've left the lake. So in this moment, one of the youngsters was gliding around in front of me, between me and the swan. So I've got this beautifully symmetrical frame of a swan coming towards me because of the side light and the shadow on the other side of the face, the perfect frame of the bow wave, the sort of symmetrical nature of the bow wave, that all of these elements together have combined to make this quite a sort of, a compelling portrait. Now, dappled light in forests can be a really useful way to concentrate the attention on the subject. So even though this fox is relatively small in the frame, your eye goes immediately to him because he's the only part of the frame that's illuminated by direct sunlight. Now, of course, images like this require a lot of luck because the pools of sunlight in this part of the forest are very small. And as this fox was sort of moving towards me, I was sort of hoping, I was preparing for him to walk through a pool of light. In terms of exposure, you've got two different options that I tend to use. You can either expose directly for the small pool of sunlight, hope the fox will work through it and shoot it on a manual exposure, or you can look at the whole frame as one, use exposure compensation. And for a frame like this, I'll be looking at using negative compensation at around -1 2/3 or about -1 1/3. But again, this spotlighting effect is a very effective way of focusing all of the viewer's attention on the subject. And the same thing really with this tiger. We've all heard the phrase eye of the tiger. So when this sort of sub-adult tiger was emerging out of the forest towards me, I was very fortunate. I shot a burst of frames. In this sequence, I'd actually exposed manually because I committed to only photograph the tiger when he passed through pools of sunlight. And so I set my exposure manually. That way, if I knew any part of the tiger, whether it's small or whether it dominated the frame, the exposure was the same and it would be accurate. And the fact that you've just got this one piercing, penetrating eye that's illuminated, the rest of the face in shadow, is what gives this image, I think, its drama. And of course, again, the centrally placed pupil, we know that this tiger is interested, he's alert, he's not falling asleep. So you've got that connectivity. Sticking with the spotlighting theme, this is a more conventional image, but again, by having a smaller, centrally placed but illuminated subject around a shadowed backdrop, shadowed surroundings, again, the viewer's attention is sort of concentrated on the beautiful sort of subtle elements of the cygnet itself, the soft downy fur. They almost they echo, as it were, the nature of the animal. And this is another thing that we can strive to do. Of course, it's not something, again, you can necessarily set out to do, but it certainly helps when you've captured the image. It gives it greater depth. This is the type of image I like to take. It's not everyone's cup of tea because ultimately it lacks the connectivity, it lacks eye contact. But I think as photographers, we should always be striving to try and photograph to see and to document nature in different ways, creative ways. There is no more familiar subject in the British Isles than a mute swan. They occur on virtually every body of water, lake, river, canal. So this is a swan close to me. So what I've done, it's a swan that I invested an enormous amount of time in making sure that he was comfortable in my presence. So I'd go and sit with the swans at the nest site over a period of weeks and months, hatching, getting closer to the sort of hatching day. So these swans were incredibly comfortable with my presence. So I was able to frame this swan as a sort of top-down image on my 80 to 200mm lens. This is shot at f11. And I've sort of focused it, the sort of symmetrical nature, using the neck, the sort of distant diffuse neck, and it's framed against the sort of the swan's white body. So you've got this beautiful graphic, white, almost light bulb-like image with just a subtle punctuation of color with the orange bill. Of course, introducing humor or using humor is a good way of conveying emotion. And of course, this is what we all want to do when it comes to telling the stories of the animals with which we share this planet. We want to reveal their personality. We want to reveal their character. We want to show their value and their worth. We want to show the importance of the lives that they lead. You know, we share this planet. We don't own this planet. We share this planet. So it's very important that we show the similarities between us and the animals. Now, of course, this bear doesn't have a hangover. He's not embarrassed. He's not playing hide and seek. He's just having a scratch. But these are all the sort of different sort of explanations or, you know, ways of looking at this image that we can use to kind of what we call anthropomorphize, which is where we apply human emotions to non-human animals. Equally, a mountain hare designed to smell its own feet. I don't think I'm going to go into too much detail about this, other than to say, again, I've used eye level sort of perspective. I've used a narrow aperture, probably down at f4, f5.6, but it's my perspective really by lying in the snow that's created that sort of diffuse effect, which focuses all the attention on the hare. The hare was actually just grooming itself, but so it's kind of a nice bit of good fortune really that he decided to put his paw sort of almost up his nose, I guess, and it gives the image that little element of humor. This is a hare I've known for 3 or 4 years. Fantastically confiding hare, and on this day the conditions were perfect because the hillside was blanketed in deep snow, which means I was able to capture this sort of diffuse surroundings around this hare. Sticking with the theme of humor, this is a bear cub. Decided you can never know what to expect when you're surrounded, or you have the privilege of being surrounded by bear cubs, as we were in Kamchatka the year before last. Well, his mum was fishing. This bear cub and his sibling were always sort of running around playing. This one stood up, decided to scratch his back on a stick. The stick itself is not the most photogenic, but it was still just a really nice moment because you've got the innocence of the cub, a behavior that we've all engaged in, and because he's stood upright, he's become bipedal, he's gone two-legged. So it's showing the bear in a sort of a slightly different light as well. It's quite nice actually. I'm kind of rattling through images faster than I normally would because I wanted to show you quite a few images, but it only really leaves me about a minute to talk about each one. Another way we can sort of show the sort of nature of these animals is to show the conditions in which they have to survive. And with mountain hares especially, they live in the most extreme and extraordinary environments. And you can imagine now, if you look at this mountain hare picture, how the hare is completely encrusted in snow and ice. And obviously, by definition, the photographer lying quietly next to her in the same conditions is not looking dissimilar. So incredibly challenging conditions in which to work. The sheer nature of even trying to look through the lens and focus when you've got this sort of swirling spindrift. But in the moments of calm in between, I wanted to focus in, shot her in portrait shape, and then I transformed the image into black and white because I think that really showed off the detail of the ice encrusted fur. And this is, again, it's an image that's all about the environment and it's about giving context to the animal. So it's a beautiful quiet wood close to where I live. In the 10 to 15 years I've photographed in this wood, there's only been one evening where the air has been thick with insects. So I don't know what it was about that special evening. It's not something I've seen before or something I've seen since. So I was very fortunate that a badger came out. Badgers are beautiful, beautiful creatures, incredible sense of smell. Eyesight's not so great. I don't think the hearing, they don't seem to react much to sounds anyway. So yeah, just a nice, peaceful, tranquil image of a beautiful and valuable and environmentally essential part of UK natural history. Puffins so often look worried. I guess if I was walking around on slippery rocks on the top of a 150-foot cliff, then I would too, but of course puffins can fly. He's not worried. It's just something about the characterful nature. Their faces are so full of personality, so full of charm. And even though I've shot from a slightly sort of elevated viewpoint, and I've used quite a slow shutter speed to show the streaks of the rain, it's all about the expression in this image. It's all about the puffins, how communicative his face appears. Again, it's always anthropomorphism. We'll never get to know exactly what these creatures are thinking, but the more that as a photographer I can show similarities between ourselves and other species, so people would be more inclined to care about, will seek to protect, you know, these other creatures, these other birds that are so important, so valuable to our UK sort of heritage. Obviously, a red deer is an incredibly majestic creature. So you often want to sort of almost try and reveal it within a majestic landscape. And some of the pine forests of Scotland during a blizzard form a perfect backdrop to set off what is our only native deer species. So yeah, these conditions were perfect in so much as half an hour before I took this image, there was no snow on the ground. This was a ferocious storm that blew through, and it had a transformative effect on the landscape and on the deer. This deer has actually shaken the snow off it. So we've got that contrast between a landscape that's completely covered in snow and the deer that sort of, it stands out quite nicely. But it's still nice to sort of try and contextualize your images to show something of the character, something of the nature of the creature that you're working with within the surroundings that are sort of relevant to that creature. Traveling now back over to the Masai Mara, we're in Kenya. We've got a big, quite a large sleepy hippo lying in what looks like, it's just a muddy tributary of the Mara River. But again, I like to, much as with the mute swan earlier, it's nice to have an abstract nature to your images. And I was immediately drawn to this. We might have been looking for leopards on this morning, but when I see something that's as immediately compelling and as interesting as this, it's a downward looking perspective. So it's not usual, but ultimately a good picture is a good picture. And I just loved, as this hippo was rising and falling in the water, so his head was forming these different shapes. And I think it's made this quite an interesting image. And it's just another way of looking at how you can sort of reveal the character and nature of the subjects, which, as you know, this is what I think we should strive to do ultimately. This was a potentially quite precarious situation because the mum and the two cubs had walked over the estuary shallows towards us. And whilst the mum had gone over to that way, to the right, this cub decided to come running straight towards me and a group of photographers that I was leading on a photographic trip. And obviously everyone knows the old adage about you never get between a bear cub and its mother. And so this was actually the last image that I took in this sequence because I didn't want a bear cub, as photogenic and as photographically interesting as it was. I didn't actually want a bear cub running amongst us. Fortunately, he deviated away. He was just, but in this moment, you have that look in his face. He's a cheeky bear cub. Again, you've got the whites of the eye. He's giving you that kind of slightly side eye. He looks a bit, yeah, he just looks like he's got a playful side. He looks like he's full of character. And of course, you've got that mighty paw. I mean, I'm assuming that this is a young male because of the size of the paw, and having seen just what these bears turn into as they grow and develop. This is why I'm estimating this is a young boy. Also, the confident nature of his behavior, which tends to be more typical with bears. Obviously, it's always nice to have, again, so this lacks that connectivity, it lacks the eye contact, But anything that shows the personality or the character of a subject, I think counts as a portrait. And this is showing a hare it might not be able to see me, but it's alert, it's listening for me. It's an essential part of how it keeps itself safe in the mountains, whether that's the flapping of a descending golden eagle or an approaching stoat or fox. This is a fundamentally important part of the armory, the protective armory that a mountain hare engages in order to keep itself safe. And I really like images like this because they're a bit different. I think they're still quite compelling because the ears are beautifully symmetrical. Again, it's shot at f5.6, so I've been able to, by using the perspective carefully, I've thrown the whole scene into this wash of white because, again, the mountains were covered in snow, so it was perfect conditions. So again, think outside the box, be flexible, be creative. Don't assume if you can't see all of the animal or if the animal is facing away from you that you still can't make a compelling and interesting image, because you definitely can. So keep your mind flexible. This is an image that's all about bliss for me. I can't imagine what it must be like as an infant cygnet, just 1 day old. So to come from the inside of an egg, this young mute swan cygnet is now bathing in the warm glow of its mother's plumage. So it's lying on its mother's back. So again, by investing an inordinate amount of time in building a bond of trust between myself and these swans, I was able to work at such close proximity. And as you can see from the image, the cygnet completely trusts me. She feels completely comfortable. She's just rolling her head, but she looks so blissed out. And why wouldn't she be? She's in the safest place on earth, because mute swans are the most ferocious parents that you can ever encounter. Equally, we can use frames. We can use frames within nature to try and create an extra element to our portrait. So here, the adult swan's neck is wrapped around and the cygnet sort of poked a head through. So again, it's sort of keeping abreast of what the possibilities are. I actually looked at crop in this image, so it was filled more with the plumage, but then I started to lose the beautiful sweep of the mother's neck, and against the green backdrop, I like the contrast. So I've left it full frame, but again, it's just a way of thinking of the different ways that you can capture sort of compelling animal portraits, and again, that tries to show some of the nature and some of the character, because when the cygnets are this size, the characters are soft, their personalities, they are so loving and so nurturing, so tender and so caring, and the mother is so ferociously protective, and she's sort of enshrouded, as it were, the youngster. Again, trust is so important for me with the way I work, because as a wildlife photographer, I'm always striving to take pictures that other photographers are just unable to take, because perhaps they're not afforded the same luxury of time that I am. So when I work up in the Scottish mountains, and I work up there every day for 5 weeks, so that's 5 weeks solid. So every day for 35 days, I walk up the same mountain, I go and photograph the same hare. And by doing that, you build up such an incredible sort of depth of knowledge, encyclopedic depth of knowledge with regard to behavior, the territories that they live in. And I get to know their characters. And this was a hare that I knew was incredibly confiding. And on this day, I'd lay next to this hare in the rain, waiting for a photographic opportunity for several hours, because there was no other opportunities. But I knew that this was the hare that I wanted to work with. And so when he sat down in this hollow and I was able to stand above him, I was able to frame this tight portrait. Again, one of the great things with the 200 to 400 millimeter lens that I use, or the 180 to 400, the new one, which I covet and I will get at some point, is that it's so close focusing. So you can frame these really tight portraits. And as photographers, for someone like me that often works at close quarters, that is such an invaluable tool, because you simply I couldn't have taken this picture on a 500 or a 600, because their minimum focusing distance is sort of 3 or 4 meters, whereas on the 200 to 400 it's a fraction of that. So this was an image made by the flexibility of that lens. I love the contemplative nature of this image. Again, because of the nature of the surroundings, what I've done is I've excluded everything. By doing that, I've had to cut off fundamentally important parts of the bear, but it was better to lose the bear's nose than it was to incorporate distracting, bright, sunlit water or messy rocks from the river behind. So I've isolated a type portrait. It's a portrait that's formed in three parts: the contemplative look of the eye, the massive paws, and then the textural fur detail. So you've got these 3 points that you look around the frame. So it's a frame that's full of interest. So again, don't be afraid to compose creatively. You're just looking to always incorporate the fundamentally most important part, which for this image, the anchor point for me for this image is the eye. It's the look in the eye. It's the look out of the frame. What's the bear thinking? You know, what is he thinking about in that moment? You know, when he is so relaxed, he's got his paws so beautifully framed on the rock. So yeah, an image that for me is full of depth. And that, as with the previous image and as with this image, when I talk about an image that's full of depth, I also talk about making sure that I've got front to back sharpness. This is again taken on my friend's borrowed 800mm lens. I'll name check him, name called Mark Cale, good guy, was with me on this photographic trip. So I've borrowed his 800mm lens and I framed this beautiful type portrait. But again, this bear's look is so much different. The bear's character was different, and I was able to show that in an image. He was just like a giant teddy bear. He seemed so soft. He was so peaceful. He was so tranquil. The eyes never had any menace. They never had any malevolence. And so in order to frame this type image, I've increased the ISO of my camera probably up to about 6,400 or 3,200. I've closed the aperture right down to create as much depth of field that I can, probably down at about f16, and I've got front to back sharpness. So it's an image that you can look around every corner of the frame. It's all sharp, it's all detailed, whether you're looking at the moss or the lichens on the rock or the bear's eyes or its fur detail. So again, just you know, think about when you're working on type portraits, making sure you increase the depth of field so you bring the whole image, where appropriate, front to back sharpness. This is a bird called a curlew. I've put it in because it's a graceful bird, and this is a sort of a naturally balletic pose. It's an image I've probably not shown before because in certain ways, in terms of the light wasn't ideal, but sometimes overcast light is great for revealing fur and feather detail. So don't dismiss working in what you'd call suboptimum light, because for certain subjects it's actually perfect. A lot of my mountain hare pictures, the close-up pictures, are taken in overcast light. The bear images were taken in overcast light. So this one, again, it's about the balletic pose. It's graceful, it's elegant, and whilst it might be looking out of the frame in that moment, distractions to the left of the frame meant that I had to compose it like this. Symmetry is also a big thing with me. I do like symmetry. I can be a bit of a neat freak when it comes to images. So I've got this hare running towards me. I didn't want to frame him central in the frame, so I was using the peripheral focusing points because they were very reliable. The hare was just sort of gambling towards me, and really for me, it's the symmetrical pose of the ears, the framing of the 2 front legs between the 2 back legs, and of course the sort of the lovely bright eyes as this hare's running towards me. One of the good things about working in a snow-covered landscape is there's no consequence to shooting it with a closed down aperture, so you've got more depth of field. So in this circumstance, I cover my bets, I cover my options, so I increase my ISO to sort of 1600, even though it's a bright overcast day. I stop down to about f8, which gives me a good few inches more of depth of field, and that way if I happen to drop the autofocus onto the shoulder of the hare, the face will still be nice and sharp. Sticking with the symmetrical theme, this is a rabbit, another lagomorph, sort of shot against a shadowed backdrop, because again it focuses the eye's attention on the hare itself, on the rabbit itself rather. And then we've got the textural detail. So going back to what I did with the bears, again front to back sharpness, a slightly abstract quality as this swan is preening, so it's a nice close-up image. It's all about feather detail. This is the sort of image that you can only take when the light is overcast, so these are a perfect subject for when the conditions are slightly overcast. And I love the sort of abstract, beautiful, soft tones within this frame. Second to last image, I put this one in because it's an image that's become a real firm favorite of mine. I love the spherical shape of the head. I love the cracking ice on its back and the air filled with spindrift. And again, it's an image that shows the nature of these animals. It shows the conditions in which they have to endure to survive. So yeah, it's an image that's full of interest, and it was successful in a few different competitions last year and this year. So it's an image that I'm always incredibly attached to. And so from me, it's goodbye and thank you for joining me. And I'm going to hand over to Richie now, who's hopefully going to fire over some questions. So if you do have any questions, please do fire them over. This is so thank you. And we hand over to Richie.
Sorry, Andy, we've got loads of questions, so I'm going to fire a couple over to you. One thing I will say, guys, if we don't get all of the questions answered, we are doing another session this evening, that you guys can join, and we'll have Andy in that session as well, so you can answer any of his other questions that you might have for him as well. So a couple of questions I'll fire at you, Andy. Is there an animal that you'd like to photograph that you haven't already?
Polar bear.
Okay.
Polar bear and cubs. Polar bear cubs emerging from their winter dens in Wapusk National Park in Manitoba is my absolute dream, and I genuinely hope to be able to make it happen. It's a place that I would love to lead photographic trips. It's so exquisitely beautiful. I think my previous history of working in lots of snow with mountain hares, I know how beautiful it can be. I've never even seen a polar bear. So yeah, without question, polar bears would be my number one.
Can you just give us an overview of your decisions on around whether you're using shooting handheld, whether you're using tripods, whether you're using monopods? Do you use a camera strap as well?
A lot of these images are actually either handheld, because that's another great thing with my 200 to 400. Obviously, when I'm shooting the tight images of the bears on the tripod with the 800, on a tripod, I'm not hand holding an 800. It can be done for a few seconds. But with the images of the mountain hares, the brown hares, I'm usually resting the camera on the ground. What I'll sometimes do is, if I'm working in snow, I'll basically build a little mound, as it were, tap it down so it becomes hard. And then when you put the tripod mount or the camera on that mound, you've got really speedy rotation, because it's basically like a ball of ice. So you don't have to carry a tripod up, and that way you can create a mound of snow as high or as low as you need it. So you can always create the perfect perspective. And that's critically important, because so often with photography, it is about those little margins where, you know, having the camera just up an inch or so might reveal a little bit of heather coming through the snow. So by seeing that, noticing it, and then just lowering the camera level down a little bit, you can make the image the best it can be, because it's so important to check your images in situ. Realize the mistakes you're making when you're there, so you can correct them when you're there. Don't wait to get home. Don't just think that'll do. Never ever think that'll do. Always think, I love that image. Is there anything I can do to make it better?
Next question is are you ever concerned about safety when you're photographing such dangerous animals like the bears, tigers, and so on?
No, never. I think you always have to have a healthy level of respect. With the bears, especially in Kamchatka, we always have rangers with us. The rangers they've worked with these bears for 10, 15, 20 years. They know every individual bear by character, by personality, by name. We also photograph during the peak of the salmon run. So the bears are always gorged, they're always really full. There is occasionally a little bit of conflict between the bears, but as long as myself and my photographic group don't actually dive into the river and start trying to take salmon out of the river, the bears will have never shown even the slightest bit of interest in us. But of course, the welfare of the animal is paramount. You know, it can't be, you can't make it more important. You know, it's because any conflict between the bear and the people, it will be the bear that suffers the most. So yeah, as a wildlife photographer, we have an incredible sense of responsibility to never jeopardize the well-being of the animals with which we work. So that's what we do. So no, I've never felt any menace.
What would be your best piece of advice for an amateur wildlife photographer who really wants to just start making great, compelling wildlife images, but might not have the access to these iconic locations and species of animals?
Go outside with your camera and just walk, go and explore your local area. It's where I built my entire career, was working with subjects within 10 miles of my home. It doesn't matter where you live. If you live in urban London, you'll have an urban park where perhaps there's grey herons, fantastically compelling, detailed eyes, or creatures like grey squirrels or urban red foxes. So wherever you are in Britain, there will be stories that you can tell, photographic stories that you can tell, animals that well, it doesn't matter what animal you photograph. If you photograph an animal in exquisite light, the photo will be exquisite, because it so often is about the light, and you will learn so much more by working locally, work in your local area, and you'll build up this really encyclopedic knowledge about the behaviors, when these behaviors occur, how the light falls in different locations at different times of year. So yeah, bears and tigers are brilliant and they're great, but leave them for a later date. Learn your craft, and to do that, I'd concentrate on working locally.
Andy, what are your thoughts on how far you would crop into a photo? Do you do cropping at all or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I love entering competitions, so obviously I try and get it right in camera, but I wouldn't hesitate if I've got, say you've got a landscape image on screen now, I wouldn't hesitate to crop that to a portrait shape. It wouldn't be an image, therefore, that I'd entered a competition once I'd cropped it that far, but the level of detail that you can capture in some of these images now in terms of resolution is just incredible. So yeah, I mean, my rule is always to try and get it right in camera, and I don't ever shoot and just think, oh, it's all right, I'll crop it later. I'll put a teleconverter on. I always want to get it as perfect as I can there and then, which means taking control of the white balance, taking control of the composition, taking control of all of that stuff. But sometimes you'll take an image and you'll just think that would work really well as a portrait, cut it to a portrait, and you're good to go. So no hesitation at all.
Next question is, have you ever had any issues with getting all of your larger kit abroad, especially when it comes to traveling with such a large amount of kit?
Yeah, I've never had any issues, because one of the things I always say if I get asked about it is basically my photographic equipment is not insured unless it's on me. So that's the first thing I will always say. So I've only ever had one airline that tried to remove my hand luggage and put it in the hold. And I sort of said to them that I wanted a written guarantee that my camera equipment would be insured by them, because it was worth like thousands of pounds. There's various tricks. I would never encourage anything that was a bit, but there's various things that people can do. I've heard of photographers, for example, turning up at the airport with a coat with large pockets, putting lots of lenses and batteries especially in the pockets, weighing their hand luggage, bringing it in at under 10 kilos, and then leaving the desk and then unloading all the stuff from their pockets. But of course, I would never advise anyone to do anything like that. I just obey all the rules all the time. So there's various ways to get around it. But yes, I keep all of my equipment on me, because I'm not going to let my photographic equipment go in the hold.
There's loads of comments as well about people just saying that you've got some fantastic images, and they really enjoy listening and hearing about the story behind your images as well. So loads of people saying that they think the talk has been fantastic.
That's good. Thank you very much. That's very kind.
One question, which is, what's the greatest piece of advice that you've ever been given that's kind of stuck with you?
That is a tricky one. What's the greatest piece of advice? I can't think of a single piece of advice that someone's given me, because so many people have given me so many different pieces of advice. But the piece of advice that I would give to people would be completely authentic, be completely honest, always put the welfare of your subject first, because it's just an image versus it's the life of another living being. Work locally. Yeah, always be on it, or always be honest, completely authentic, and don't fall in love with the idea of wildlife photography. Don't think, if I become a wildlife photographer, it sounds like cool and I can just ride around on elephants photographing tigers. Wildlife photography is actually lying in a field at 3 o'clock in the morning photographing brown hares. The tigers and stuff come later. So yeah, be honest, be authentic, work locally, and realize that a good reputation takes years to develop, and a bad reputation can occur in an instant. So just do the right thing without exception, and you won't go far wrong.
Can you just give us a quick overview of how you would decide what f-stop you'd shoot at, especially if you wanted front to back sharpness on some of the tiger shots or bear shots? And then also it's about light conditions. I think the modern cameras now that I use, the D6, it's got such a fantastic flexibility in terms of the ISO. So I generally get to know what ISO I'm happy with on a camera. So on my D4S, I would be shooting at sort of 6,400 or 12,800 ISO, because that's what I knew I was happy with at that lens.
with that kind of ISO, working in the light that I often work in, I could always get to sort of f11, f16, f22 without any problem and still maintain a fast enough shutter speed. So get to know your equipment first and foremost, do different tests. But what I would say is the danger you can make is if you're working in marginal light is never underexposed, because then when you lighten it in post-processing, you introduce noise. So I always shoot to the right of the histogram. I give it plenty of exposure, and that gives me a true indication of what my camera can handle in terms of ISO performance.
So I think we are just about bang on time. So I'm going to end that there. If there's any questions that we haven't answered, as I mentioned, we've got another session with Andy later on today. So you can join that and ask us any questions in there as well. Andy, thank you so much for taking us through some of your wonderful images. Thank you for everybody joining us. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Pleasure. Thank you. Take care.